Everything for our live stream for Mass down into this room so Father could give a really good talk for all of you guys. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jace Palmer. I'm the coordinator for Young Adult and campus. All of your friends. John, I've known him for maybe a little over a year now. First time I got to spend time with him was on the disc golf course.
Oh, yeah.
While I was fundraising as a summer missionary, but now we both work for the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. He's a priest, and I work at the Pastoral Center. You're not going to meet a more fun-loving priest than Father John. He also just truly knows how to love. I remember I was riding on a bus with him from Oklahoma City to Indianapolis for NCYC, and the amount of fatherly love that Father John gave to me over that trip really fed my soul, and it's time that he spent with me, and he really let me know that I was loved. So without further ado, to talk about how do we thrive during coronavirus, we have Father John Herrera.
Thanks, Jason. Hello, everyone. Good. I don't know if I'm going to get used to looking at a camera, but yeah, so thank you, Jace. I appreciate that. Those very thoughtful words. So the talk tonight is how to thrive, why to thrive. In kind of preparing for this talk, I looked up the word thrive and kind of its origins. It's actually an Old Norse word that's reflexive, which means it's something that you do. The Old Norse word is thrikas, which means to get a hold of. In other words, to get a hold of oneself. Maybe sometimes you see in like a moment of crisis in a movie, the other character will say, "Get a hold of yourself." So thriving has to do with grasping a hold of life, getting a hold of it. In other words, finding a purpose or a meaning. I wanted to share with you all just some reflections on purpose and meaning and how that is intrinsically tied to thriving. There was a man who lived through World War II. He was actually imprisoned in 4 different Nazi concentration camps. His name was Viktor Frankl, or Frankl if you prefer. And he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning, his study of logotherapy, a form of psychology, a study of psychology and a philosophy of sorts. Viktor Frankl, having lived through 4 separate concentration camps, can you imagine the horrors that he saw, the things that he lived through, his unique experience coming out of this as a psychologist? Really, it colored the way that he would present what is authentic time and after when he wrote his life's work, was that the people who died in Auschwitz, who died in whichever camp, more often died from a lack of meaning rather than a lack of food. And I think especially for those of us who are living through this corona craziness, right now we have so much undifferentiated, and to be fair, I am not likening our circumstances to a concentration camp. It's not that severe. But for those of us who are living with so much undifferentiated free time, right? I think that's what they call it in preschools now, or unscheduled free time. All kind of grasping at like, what is the new normal? Is this the new normal, or are things going to go back to normal sooner rather than later? It's a real life transition for everyone. And so how do we make this time meaningful is an important question. Just sitting over here, that's why I keep looking over there. So anyway, so how do we find purpose, meaning amidst all of this? Lack of meaning creates an existential void inside our lives that we quickly are ready to fill with immediate gratification if we don't see what is going on and break the cycle. So I think, binge watching Netflix during all this free time will only go so far. Then eventually we're going to really start feeling like blah. For those of you who have kids, maybe binge watching Netflix is not an option to you, but you can only go so long, playing patty cake and coloring things with your kids and making meals, and everything else that you do as a parent before you start to go crazy. So, addiction, anger, depression, not necessarily in that order, will be the things that start to fill that existential void, which ultimately leads to despair. So we need purpose, we need meaning. There are, for Viktor Frankl, he outlines 3 sources of meaning. The first one is this: pursuing a life task. When Frankl entered the infamous Auschwitz death camp, the Nazi guards stripped him of all his possessions, including the manuscript of his life's work. After going through a period of grief and denial, Frankl vowed that he would survive the death camp and complete his work. He said, "It is imperative that I survive to finish my work." He knew that he was uniquely qualified to write on logotherapy. He alone had his collection of experiences, skills, and knowledge. So the question for us is, what is our purpose? Not only in the particular, but universally. Well, one of the best books I've ever read that significantly impacted my life is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, written by Stephen Covey. One of his habits is this: begin with the end in mind. To begin with the end in mind. What is our purpose? Why have we been created? What is our goal? Well, in short answer, it's heaven, right? Communion with God for eternity, hopefully with all whom we love. So if we're going to begin with the end in mind, we'll have a much better chance of arriving at the destination if we have a clear idea about where it is that we want to end up, right? Because there's really only 2 destinations in the eternal sense. So, have you ever started a trip and someone did not send you the address to where it was that you were going towards? Maybe you decided to Google the town or the city or maybe even the state to kind of point so that you can get going in the right direction, but you didn't have the address. You were kind of just shooting randomly or semi-randomly. It's much like this in our spiritual lives and the journey towards heaven. We have to know the destination. We can't just sit passively by and expect life to succeed for us. We have to be intentional. That's kind of the buzzword right now, I think, that we use. It's a great word. We have to be intentional about what we are doing. Not just in the small things, but in the big things of life. And our minds are like homing missiles. Once we are locked on target, once we know where it is that we want to get to, all of the intermediary steps sort of start to fall together. Have you ever tried preparing ingredients and baking or cooking something without knowing exactly what it was you wanted to bake or cook? No, that's stupid. Of course not. Much the same in our spiritual life, if we do not begin with the end in mind. Okay, so the first source of meaning is pursuing a life task. In other words, knowing where it is that we are directed towards, rather than just letting life happen to us. The second source of meaning that Frankl outlines is sacrificial love. These aren't his words verbatim, but this is the way we speak about it in our Catholic parlance. When you look back on your life at the end, what do you want to be remembered for? Someone concerned only with oneself, or someone who cared deeply for others, or in the very least, one other person? During his lifetime, Frankl, he met a woman who had lost one of her sons, and the other was severely handicapped. She tried to kill herself and her son, but her disabled son prevented her from doing this. And so she goes to Frankl. She's distraught. And in order to help her to uncover a sense of meaning in her life, he asks her to imagine herself at 80 years old, having been freed from the responsibility of caring for her disabled son, enjoyed, the pleasures that would go with that, the travel or whatever it is that she would have enjoyed. without that? What would her life have been like? And her response was that she didn't really have a very vague, she only had a vague idea, not a very clear conception of what sort of meaning that would have been, that would have given her. And then, alternatively, he said to imagine her life at 80 years old, having spent most of it simply caring for her disabled son. And she said, my soul is filled with a sense of peace, knowing that I've spent my life doing something meaningful, having cared for him and made his life more full. And so Frankl offers this wonderful quote. I like it a lot. The more one forgets himself by giving himself to another person to love, the more human he is and the more he actualizes himself. I love that quote. But here I would like to add maybe a corrective hermeneutic to all that has been said from the words of Christ from the Gospel of John. Jesus says, I am the vine, and you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit, because without me, you can do nothing. Anything good we do, anything we accomplish must be in Jesus. That all that is good and lasting has its root in Jesus. He didn't say we could do a little bit without him. He said nothing. Let that sink in. Okay, and so what does that look like in regards to this self-sacrifice? It means prima gratia, that grace is first. God moves in us and allows us to accomplish anything good, including sacrificially loving others. What does that look like in a more practical sense? Well, to be honest, I think, and this is something I'm experiencing as well, is to learning to live patiently with those whom we have immediate contact with right now. A special grace, a special opportunity here in this moment to love our families in an intentional way, certainly in a sacrificial way, especially when we start to get antsy and are ready to get the heck out of our houses, right? To love those who we are in immediate contact with. Okay, so self-sacrificial love, the second source of meaning. And then finally, the third source of meaning is not in his words, but according to our parlance, redemptive suffering. Suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. This is Viktor Frankl's quote. Think of the numerous figures throughout history who have suffered with a purpose, and great redemption took place as a consequence. Think of St. John of the Cross being imprisoned by his confreres, Mother Teresa's dark night. Think of Martin Luther King Jr. and all that his followers suffered. Think of St. Damien of Molokai and the lepers whom he ministered to. You know, when we look through any story, any great story, there's obviously thousands and thousands of examples, but think of your hasn't, doesn't just relentlessly succeed. They're not someone who is just, a go-getter, rounded them out. I'm just going to use one example, recognizing that there are many, many examples. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Lord. We're going to talk about Tolkien and Nazi Germany all in the same talk. There's a band of brothers that set out in order to destroy the One Ring, the Ring of Ultimate Power. And two are sent on a special mission, the two most unlikely of all of the characters. And along the way, the main character turns, as a consequence of their trials, very vicious, very unkind towards his friend Samwise Gamgee. And Samwise suffers tremendously as a consequence of this journey. His loyalty really brings him great suffering, his loyalty to his friend. But as a consequence of his loyalty, if we find meaning, purpose for our suffering, especially our mundane suffering, because yes, granted, some of us are dealing with really heavy crosses. I get that. And this is a very uncomfortable time all of the uncertainty, not knowing particular to your life? Well, honestly, I would leave that up to you, because your life is so complex and varied with so many different forms of suffering, so many different forms of opportunities to love sacrificially, and then also so many different ways that you might specifically be called in your experiences, your knowledge, your skill set to contribute to this life. One thought I've had, especially in regards to just sort of the discomfort of the day in and day out now with so much time on